In the summer of 1644, the north of England became the decisive theatre of the civil war between Parliament and the Royalists. The city of York, the last major Royalist stronghold in the north, had been under siege for weeks by a combined Parliamentarian and Scottish army. If York fell, the whole of the north would slip from the grasp of King Charles I. To relieve the city, the Royalists dispatched their most powerful mobile force, the army of Prince Rupert of the Rhine. On 1 July, Rupert unexpectedly broke through into York, lifting the siege, but rather than remaining behind its walls, he chose to march out again on 2 July, moving west onto the open ground of Marston Moor. He intended to force the Allied army into a decisive battle on open terrain, where Royalist cavalry could fight to advantage. On the afternoon of 2 July, the two armies faced one another across a vast stretch of heathland broken by ditches, hedges, and patches of marsh. Marston Moor was no perfect parade ground. Low enclosures, drainage channels, and uneven ground would shape every charge and countercharge that followed. The Royalists numbered around 18,000 men. Their infantry held the center under Lord Ithan. Rupert commanded the cavalry on the right wing. Goring led the horse on the left. They drew up along a slight rise beside a country lane, modest high ground, yet enough to provide a natural defensive line. Artillery pieces were placed between the infantry brigades. Opposite them stood more than 27,000 Parliamentarian and Scottish troops. On their left wing was the cavalry under Oliver Cromwell, the disciplined Ironsides. The centre consisted of Scottish infantry under the Earl of Leven, and on the right wing the cavalry of Sir Thomas Fairfax. Only a few hundred meters separated the armies, though hedges and ditches cut the ground between them. For much of the afternoon both sides stood watching. Rupert believed night was approaching and that the Allies would not risk an attack so late in the day. He allowed his men to rest, and many cavalrymen even unsaddled their horses. At around 7 in the evening, the sky turned a heavy gray, wind rose, a light rain began to fall. At the very moment the Royalists relaxed their vigilance, the Allied guns opened fire. The first cannon shot shattered the long, uneasy stillness. Roundshot tore low across the moor and burst among the Royalist ranks. Scottish infantry began advancing steadily, picking their way across the ditches. Yet the true opening blow did not fall in the center. On the Allied left, Cromwell had already prepared his move. His cavalry formed in deep, ordered ranks, not in the loose, impetuous style favored by Royalist gentlemen, but in tight formation. As the artillery's first salvo ended, Cromwell gave the order to advance. The Ironsides crossed the ditch line and climbed the slight rise where Rupert's cavalry stood in partial disorder. Only then did Rupert grasp that the battle had truly begun. He hurried to rally his squadrons, but many had not yet regained their fighting formation. The first collision came in the fading light of dusk. Two masses of horse crashed together, pistols firing at near point-blank range, swords striking in the half-light. The difference soon showed. The Ironsides maintained formation, attacking in successive lines. The Royalist horse charged hard but quickly lost cohesion in the shock. Rupert personally led a fierce counter-attack, attempting to punch through Cromwell's center. The struggle was savage. Horses went down in heaps. Smoke drifted thick across the ground. Meanwhile, on the Allied right, events unfolded very differently. Fairfax's cavalry were struck hard by Goring. The broken ground shattered their formation. Goring pressed the advantage, driving them from the field in deep pursuit. In less than an hour, the two wings told opposite stories. The Allied left was gaining ground. The Allied right was collapsing, the center now closed. Scottish infantry advanced steadily, muskets firing in volleys into the Royalist line. The Royalists replied with cannon and dense musketry. Gaps began to appear in both formations. During the fighting, Cromwell was lightly wounded in the neck and briefly withdrew from the front. He soon returned and reorganized his men. That moment proved crucial. Instead of allowing his cavalry to scatter in pursuit as was common practice, he reformed them in disciplined ranks. Across the field, Rupert attempted to gather his squadrons for one last counterstroke. But the light was fading fast. The battle was slipping into twilight. Cromwell ordered his entire left wing to wheel. Rather than continuing to push Rupert back, he turned obliquely and drove toward the exposed flank of the Royalist infantry in the center. This was the first decisive turning point. Having driven Rupert from his original position, the Ironsides did not dissolve into disorder. They held their shape and swept laterally across the battlefield, cutting through smoke and crashing into the unprotected left flank of the Royalist foot. Engaged frontally with the Scots, the Royalist infantry had no time to turn and meet the blow. Their ranks began to tremble. On the Allied right, Goring was still pursuing Fairfax, unaware that the Royalist center was about to be smashed. Darkness settled fully over Marston Moor. The battle was not yet over. Night fell faster than either side had anticipated. Powder smoke mingled with the damp evening mist, reducing visibility to mere yards. Shouts, the scream of horses, and the clash of steel rang out in confusion across the moor. Yet within that chaos, the balance was shifting steadily toward the Allied army. After routing Prince Rupert's cavalry,
Cromwell's Ironsides did not pause to plunder or pursue recklessly. They were drawn back into ordered bodies and reformed in the dark.
Discipline. This was the decisive difference. Cromwell understood the field was not yet won. The Allied right had been driven off.
If Goring returned in time, the center might be crushed between two forces. Instead of pressing blindly forward, Cromwell swung his cavalry wide along the edge of the fighting, seeking a path to the rear of the Royalist infantry.
In the center, the Scottish regiments were locked in brutal close combat. Pike and shot formations clashed at short range. Long pikes bristled like a forest. Musket flashes burst through the darkness. The Royalist foot fought stubbornly,
yielding ground step by step but not yet breaking. Then came the thunder of hooves behind them.
Cromwell's cavalry emerged on their flank and struck into the rear of the Royalist line, not in scattered squadrons but in a solid mass. Muskets fired into their side. Then swords and pistol butts fell upon infantry still facing the Scots. The Royalist line began to split. Far off on the Allied right, Goring at last realized something was wrong.
The sound of cannon and shouting had shifted. He tried to gather his men and return, but his force was strung out after the long pursuit.
Reforming in darkness proved slow. That delay sealed the battle. After breaking the Royalist left, Cromwell divided his cavalry. One part continued to press the center. The other wheeled sharply toward Goring's returning horse.
The two cavalry bodies collided for a second time that evening, but now the balance was utterly different.
Goring's men were tired and disordered. Many were struck before they could properly form. The clash was brief and violent.
The Royalist cavalry dissolved. With both wings swept from the field, the center became the fatal point.
The Royalist infantry, already under pressure from two sides, were now attacked from the rear as well. In the dim light, units struggled even to recognize one another. Some regiments attempted to form defensive pike squares against cavalry, but artillery and close musket fire tore into them at short range. The gaps widened. Not all gave way at once. Certain Royalist regiments, particularly the so-called Whitecoats, stood firm to the end. They beat back cavalry with their pikes and fired at almost point-blank range. Cromwell had to launch repeated assaults to break these last knots of resistance. Behind them, Rupert attempted to rally what remained of his horse for a final effort to save the center. But when he returned, the sight was unmistakable. His infantry were fragmenting, colors falling, men streaming back toward York. There was no longer a line to restore. The Allied army launched a general advance. Scottish infantry pressed forward relentlessly. Cromwell's cavalry scythed across what remained of the Royalist front. Guns were brought closer and fired directly into the last pockets of resistance. By about 10 o'clock that night, the battle was effectively over. Royalist remnants fled in all directions. Many were lost in marsh and ditch. Others were cut down on the road to York. Marston Moor fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the labored breathing of horses. Royalist losses were immense, thousands killed or captured. In a single evening, the north of England was effectively lost to King Charles I. Yet the significance of the battle lay not only in its scale. What truly altered the course of the war was the manner of fighting. For the first time in the conflict, a cavalry force maintained discipline after its initial charge, reformed amid the chaos, and delivered a second decisive blow. That method would become the foundation of a new model of warfare. Marston Moor was not merely a great battle. It marked the collapse of Royalist cavalry supremacy and the rise of a new power on the English battlefield. As night fully covered the moor, the Royalist defeat did not come in a single instant. It spread outward in layers, like a fortress undermined from within before collapsing entirely. In the center, surviving Royalist regiments attempted an orderly withdrawal toward York. They formed pike squares, firing controlled musket volleys to keep the pursuing cavalry at bay. In the darkness, muzzle flashes illuminated mud-streaked faces and drifting smoke. But Cromwell's cavalry no longer charged headlong. They broke into smaller detachments, encircling, cutting off routes of retreat, striking at isolated groups. Rather than impaling themselves upon dense hedges of pikes, they fired from range and closed upon those already disordered. It was cold patience, not fury. To the west, Rupert tried to form a final screen. He knew that if York were entirely isolated, the north would be irretrievably lost. He drew up his remaining riders in a thin line, intending to counterattack and open a corridor for retreat. Reality allowed no such recovery. His force was no longer cohesive. Officers were missing, colors lost, men exhausted from two fierce engagements. Commands shouted into the night carried poorly. Before any concerted charge could be launched, Allied cavalry struck in segments, breaking the formation apart. In the center, the last Royalist regiments fought on, particularly those in white coats. They repelled repeated assaults, pikes thrusting back horses, muskets fired so close the smoke choked both sides. but struck from 3 directions. Their defensive ring tightened until it could shrink no further.
Cromwell ordered one final push.
Cavalry closed to within shouting distance. Fire was poured into the packed ranks. After minutes of desperate resistance, the final defensive block shattered. Survivors threw down their arms or were cut down where they stood. By around 10 o'clock, the Royalist line had ceased to exist. The battle gave way to widespread pursuit, the road to York filled with fleeing soldiers. In darkness and marshland, many lost their way, were captured, or perished. Royalist artillery was abandoned almost intact. Colors, wagons, and munitions fell into Allied hands.
The loss was not merely of men, but of the capacity to hold the North. At dawn on 3 July, sunlight revealed a devastated field.
Thousands of bodies lay across the grass among overturned guns and dead horses. The Allied army began gathering prisoners and arms. York was now completely isolated. Within days it would surrender. Marston Moor had altered the balance of the war.
From the battlefield perspective, it was not simply superior numbers that decided the day, but a chain of decisions made within hours.
The sudden attack at dusk, when the Royalists were unprepared. The discipline that held the cavalry together after the first charge. The timely wheel into the infantry's flank. Goring's fatal delay in returning to the center. Each occurred within less than 3 hours, yet together they triggered collapse. After Marston Moor, the Royalists would never regain the North. Their once proud cavalry superiority was broken. And on that smoke-covered field, a new model of coordinated, disciplined warfare had proved itself.
The battle began with Royalist confidence as they marched out from York seeking a decisive engagement on open ground. It ended in flight beneath the darkness, leaving behind not only a blood-soaked Moor, but a strategic turning point in the English Civil War.
Marston Moor was not the last battle of the war, but after the night of 2 July 1644, the balance of power had tipped, and it would never return.